Ask any American man or woman on the street whether we feel connected socially, culturally, or politically as Americans. And well, you already know the answer. While the old American monoculture throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s was rife with images of Ronald Reagan, the American prairie, and blonde homecoming queens, and only seemed to include Sarah Palin's America, there is no doubt that at the precise moment in time when America was finally starting to become more diverse and come together, several things, like the internet and the natural tensions that a true melting pot would create, began to tear us apart culturally and politically in ways that we could have never understood. By now, you already understand how the internet is making us crazy. But throw on top of that a country that has experienced radical demographic change. Now, the standard household type has shifted away from marriage, and the U.S. legalized same-sex marriage nationwide in 2015. The postmodern family is pluralistic, consisting of many small groupings that include modern nuclear families, single parents, and blended families. The U.S. has become more racially and ethnically diverse, with the chance of two people chosen at random being from different racial or ethnic groups increasing from 54.9% in 2010 to 61.1% in 2020, just 10 years later. According to the Brookings Institution, nearly 4 of 10 Americans identify with a race or ethnic group other than white, and the 2010 to 2020 decade was the first in the nation's history in which the white population declined in numbers. And what's interesting to us at the Dialogue Project is the tough conversation that never seems to take place, dealing with the repercussions that this changing demography has created. Since the invention of the internet, the division between blue state and red state folks has only gotten larger, and this division has created an antagonistic environment throughout the nation. The red staters take one good look at the blue staters and feel as if Californians like me are aggressively casting for the world's largest Benetton commercial. The blue staters look at the red staters and perceive people either afraid of change or, frankly, people afraid of giving up their perch as the ethnicity with the predominant culture. The red staters think the blue staters are running roughshod over fundamental elements of our culture that's inherent to the broader American identity. The blue staters think that the red staters are, within their pleas to make America great again, trying to freeze our country's Calvinistic cultural tendencies in amber as a way of accessing our values, in the same way that scientists at Jurassic Park froze mosquitoes in amber as a way to access dinosaur DNA. Modern media tries to adjudicate these differences by giving hot mics to pundits and talking heads, who come camera-ready with makeup and talking points, designed to win a 90-second argument in the B block of some morning show segment, rather than engage in a thoughtful conversation. And the big loser in this equation is, of course, us, the American people. That's why we're starting this podcast and future Substack. It's to take the mic back from the talking heads, and it's to begin having the real conversation, dealing with the changing America that we all must now live in. It's to take part in civic media once again that's driven more for a desire to attain understanding, rather than push a hot button. Welcome to the Dialogue Project. I wanted to spend episode 1 of the Dialogue Project talking about religion. I wanted to talk about religion because so much of what we believe as a nation flows from our religious beliefs, or lack thereof. Ever since Donald Trump's takeover of the GOP, it's undeniable that evangelical Christians, the group most responsible for Trump's success, have reasserted their dominance within American culture in recent years, expressing the fact that our fundamentalist Christian principles were under assault by the media, by academia, and by a new wave of immigrants who refuse to assimilate. I wanted to tackle this subject because, ever since the rise of Trump, people like me have had deep conversations that involve what Pastor Russell Moore, director of the Public Theology Project at Christianity Today, refers to as the delineation of thinking of America as a Christian nation or of a nation that simply boasts a majority of Christian people.
Sometimes people ask whether or not America was founded as a Christian nation, and one has to say, well, what do you mean by a Christian nation? If what you mean by that is a nation in which most of the people profess to be Christians, then certainly the United States of America was and is a Christian nation based upon that sociological definition of a Christian nation. That's not what most people mean, though, when they say Christian nation. What they mean is the idea that God was in covenant with the United States of America in order to bless the United States of America as a special people, as a new Israel, as a group of people covenanted under Christianity? And the answer to that is clearly no. The founders of the United States of America were influenced deeply by Christian ideas, including ideas that came out of the Protestant Reformation. They were also influenced deeply by ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. But they did not found the country as a Christian nation, which is why there is, for instance, no religious test for office holders, and why there is a separation between the responsibilities of the state from the responsibilities of the church or of worshiping communities in the United States. I think that the confusion often comes in when people assign to the United States of America a providential place in history that the Bible never assigns it.
As Trump and evangelicals have become more prominent, they've become more comfortable in asserting that America was created solely to serve as a bastion for Christianity. Personally, I suspect that the evangelical people that I know well and care about in my own life have become more sensitive, some might even say entitled, about how accommodating America should be of newer cultures. After all, if the sole purpose of America's existence is to preserve the most important thing in your life, then why would you ever want it to adapt, grow, modify, or change? Maybe even more concerning, imagine that you're an American evangelical and you're at a city council meeting looking to approve construction of a Baptist church in your neighborhood. Because you wholeheartedly believe that it's the principle and values of your religion, essentially the golden rule, that provides a fundamental bedrock of morality for your community, you have no problem with it. Now swap out the Baptist church for a Buddhist temple, who preach a near-identical golden rule. Are you equally okay with both churches? Or do you use providential theory as a justification to begin turning America into your own personal theocracy? That's why this is important. That's why we went out searching for the perfect person to speak to on the Dialogue Project. Meet Rachel, immigrant from India, hailing from that country's small but proud Christian minority. She's landed in Jersey, a place that's got more Tony Soprano, Shui Adele, and Salvador Bapincero than any one person can naturally shake a stick at.
And I definitely want to ask you about your background and your family's background. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Christians make up, 2 or 3% of India?
That's right, 2%.
Okay. So how did your family come to be Christian? And when you were growing up, you said, when you were in school, you were the only one, but did you have a community of Christians you grew up in your hometown, or what was that overall experience like?
I'm not entirely sure how. I'm assuming it was somewhere when the British were ruling India that my great grandparents converted. We have stories, but we don't have we don't know for sure when and how that happened. My grandparents were Christian. My great grandparents were Christian. As far as down the line, I know they were Christian, and I was born Christian. We went to a church that was planted by German missionaries. So our songs were all translated from German. So, we sang it in our native language, but they were translated from German. They had German tunes.
Now, Rachel works as a political consultant for a MAGA congressional candidate. Additionally, she wholeheartedly believes that culture is linked to policy and religion, and all of that is linked to the role that America plays in the world. Based on a broader narrative, you'd think that Rachel's religious persecution in India was a major factor into her move to America and her decision to become a born-again evangelical. But life is never that simple. While her Christian community faced some incidents of persecution, they were mainly encouraged to exist as society's wallpaper, barely noticeable in the background. That's when she came to America in her 20s, met her husband, and strengthened her commitment to evangelicalism. And yes, that's when things once again get tricky, because much like the same evangelicals who believe in Russell Moore's definition of a providential Christian nation, so too did Rachel.
And then I met my husband, and he's an evangelical Christian. We met online, and We got married, and I moved here, assuming that everybody was like me here, and of course that's not the case. But yeah, that's pretty much my background as far as Christianity is concerned.
And once again, here's where things get tricky. Not just for Rachel, but for so many current evangelicals whom, on one hand, will tell you that they love their neighbors and the community that they live in. And yet on the other hand, they'll say that America is doomed and that the same neighbors that they just profess to loving will ultimately be responsible for our collective and cultural downfall. Like so many non-religious libertarian folks like me living during the Trump era, we can't always help but quietly wonder if there's a gap between the persecution that Christians are sure will be arriving at their front doorsteps tomorrow and the actual persecution that they face today. Ask most evangelicals about whether they're in a fight to save their culture, and most likely it'll sound like this.
I feel like that is the biggest problem that conservatives have with liberals, is that that the line keeps shifting. With each passing, even in the short time I've been here, the 24 years that I've been here, I've seen the line consistently shift. And the things that we, initially, we shifted too because we had to, because the line keeps shifting. So we shifted too, not necessarily willingly, but just because there's no other way to be. We can't live in society if we hold on to where we were 20 years ago. So we've shifted too, but we're kind of like grabbing onto the line for dear life and being pulled as much as we can and try to hold on while we're being pulled. That's the way I look at it.
And I think what you're describing, tell me if you've heard this phrase before, but like Flight 93 mentality, right? And it's kind of a morbid phrase, but it's kind of like, the plane is going down and we have to charge the cockpit before the whole country, goes down. I've heard conservatives use that analogy, as morbid as it might be, many times, kind of to explain how you feel, right? That this is the predicament we're in. Liberals are sort of taking the country from us. They're upending the traditions and the morals that the founding fathers instilled, and we're going in a completely different direction. And because you have to fight back, it's you need to play by tougher rules, right? Did I capture how you feel about that as well?
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like we're we want violence or something like that. Though, that's not what I'm saying. But yes, I think that most conservatives would say that it's always us that makes the compromise. It's always us that loosens the rules. It's always us that has to kind of bend and shift. And it has come to a point where conservatives feel we can't do this anymore because we are losing who we are.
And so those three little words, who we are, is what will forever make the topic of religious identity so complicated in America. Because who we are is subjective. Who we are is determined by the eye of the beholder. After all, your political, religious, cultural, or socioeconomic identity is always what we perceive it to be in our own minds. That's why it's an identity. So for people like me, on the outside looking in, all that we can do to try to understand the perceived loss of identity within the evangelical church is to ask the most obvious questions possible. The questions pertaining to how we go about our everyday lives.
Right. And I think one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you, by the way, I told you I grew up in Mississippi, right? So I have a lot of friends who feel the exact same way you do and voted for Trump and will vote for him again coming up in September, in November. And But one of the things I frequently ask them, Rachel, because, I listen to Fox, I listen to conservative radio out of curiosity. Every now and then I might agree with a point or two. But what I typically hear on these media outlets is, kind of isolated stories, right? In San Francisco, there's, drag queens that are reading stories to kids, or somewhere in New York in a school district, a teacher prevented someone from saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And oftentimes I wonder, there's probably a version of that extremism on the other side. And what if, 5% of liberals are crazy and 5% of conservatives were crazy, and both sides are kind of just choking on these, small percentages of people. We're worried about these folks rather than realizing that they don't really represent the broader, populace of America. Is that a fair critique, or do you feel like most liberals are, kind of godless and lawless and trying to take over and, have an agenda?
I think the worry, the concern is not that one drag queen at a library, but the fact that we have seen that it never stays where it is.
In the past 10 years, it's my opinion that the belief in what Pastor Russell Moore calls providential theory has created both an increasing sense of cultural alarm among evangelicals, leading to that famous phrase, "take our country back," and B, a sense that evangelicals must become increasingly vigilant to protect the culture. From the libertarian outside looking in, I don't see Christians under attack. Honestly, for people who aren't knee-deep into evangelicalism, I tend to think that it's confusing that the pure brand of Christianity, the one which focused on protecting and looking out for the least among us, and the one more representative of a 100-year-old ex-president sweating it out on a Habitat for Humanity rooftop, rather than a 78-year-old ex-president who brags about putting kids in cages, would be the brand of Christianity that would be more attractive. If it's the need to adhere to fundamentalist tradition that evangelicals are so driven by, then why the tendency to change, sometimes overnight? See the paradox? In America today, Christians still comprise roughly 65% of the population, and an overarching cultural sense embodying Ronald Reagan, apple pie, Lee Greenwood, NASCAR, fighter jets, and John Cougar Mellencamp's Ain't That America, You and Me is still alive and kicking in every Trump county in America. But now, another tricky part. Despite Norman Rockwell and Christianity being alive and well, evangelicals feel a non-coming erasure of their original culture. Rachel is correct to point out that the line keeps shifting, because naturally, American culture keeps changing as the world goes round and round. However, these changes aren't just coming from one political party or one social group. Take gay marriage, for instance. 3 decades ago, it had virtually no conservative support. Today, 44% of Republicans support it, with 59% of self-identified moderate Republicans in favor. Or how about abortion? The state of Kansas predicted that evangelicals would want to rid the state of the procedure outright. But when it came time for a statewide referendum, those same conservative voters had other ideas. How about in 2016, when Donald Trump, at least for 2 to 3 weeks, came out in support for LGBTQ rights and convinced 16,000 people at the Republican National Convention to cheer for it?
As your president, I will do everything in my power to protect our LGBTQ citizens from the violence and oppression of a hateful foreign ideology. Believe me.
In my opinion, whenever conservative voters attribute the totality of social change to the other side, they're looking for a narrative that can crystallize a good guy, bad guy construct. Because packaging your movement through aggrievement is always easier and more emotionally evocative than telling Kansas's conservative voters that there's probably a 68% mushy middle of voters who agree on abortion compromise. That mushy middle, that message of common ground plus or minus 15%, it never sells on the internet or on cable TV, does it? Look, a lot of you may be just like me. You've got evangelical friends. But whenever you press these friends on why things are so bad, or why they feel persecuted, well, they seem to have roughly the same percentage of gripes about living in an imperfect society as everyone else. And often, they themselves become part of a new mushy middle, without even knowing it.
But would a fair criticism be that if you can only conjure 2 or 3 or 4 examples of how liberalism in general affects day-to-day life, and I can only do the same, would it be fair to say that at the height of either one of our partisanship spells that we could just be blowing things out of proportion a little bit?
You could say that, but on the other hand, you could also say that you're being the frog in the boiling water,
This is typically the point in any productive conversation where both parties may decide to agree to disagree. To recap, here's what Rachel and I agree on. We both like our lives and enjoy the company of our neighbors. We rate our overall quality of life high. Occasionally, maybe every 18 to 24 months, something will happen in society that irks us, that makes us feel like a law should be changed to protect our fundamental rights. For Rachel, there was an incident involving a teacher in one of her son's classrooms becoming far too opinionated about the role of religion. For me, that same gripe may be related to a gun control law. And so now we come to the trickiest part of all. From my frustrated point of view, this is what I see happening. If you think of America as a crowded theater that we all collectively occupy, it's become socially acceptable for evangelicals to yell fire, even though, like us, they only occasionally see someone light a match from time to time. Their natural response to this, however, is that they have irrefutable proof of the oncoming fire, even though conditions in the theater now don't seem to indicate an oncoming conflagration. As any evangelical will tell you, we're losing who we are. And the pathway to reducing this perceived loss of identity within evangelical communities doesn't involve dismissing concerns. Taken at face value, I didn't like the fact that the teacher in Rachel's son's classroom inserted him or herself so heavy-handedly into their teaching lesson. While Rachel might remedy this by supporting school prayer, I would favor the true separation of church and state. Miraculously, either of our solutions might prevent the aforementioned incident from happening in the future. Overall, once the outrage relating to issues like these have been drowned out, and we're left with the rather unsexy task of governing ourselves and getting along, something tells me that if we force the right conversations and refuse to get caught up in a Groundhog Day-like, talking points-driven, name-calling, cable news media hellscape, today's current hot-button issues will, over time, simply become part of America's overarching mushy middle, while more substantive issues like income inequality, climate change, and global diplomacy can once again return us to a civic existence that isn't just more rewarding and harmonious, but also more dignified. This will be a space where everyone's beliefs are respected, but conversely, everyone must also explain their beliefs and stand by them in the most logically satisfying way possible. So how do we do this? After a piece like the one you just heard, my original conversant, the person I'm disagreeing with, will always have a chance to issue an equal time rebuttal. Should they decline, we'll keep our conversation going. For instance, as a follow-up to episode 1, the Dialogue Project would like to ask our guests the following questions. First, regarding shifting moral boundaries within the evangelical community, do evangelicals fear a day when the fight surrounding the preservation of an identity begins to subsume the mission of their entire identity itself? In other words, is today's Christianity all about the fight? And regarding that mushy middle, I'd like to have a follow-up conversation with Rachel about the contradiction between A, adhering to a belief system which states that Americans must stick to a static state of cultural values while consistently shifting their own personal values, as they did so freely with Trump in 2016, whenever getting behind the new Caitlyn Jenner revolution, or in Kansas in 2020 when it came to abortion. Like they say in horror movies, isn't the call coming from inside the house? Next, how can the evangelical community's values occupy a space in American culture that is supposedly nobly steadfast and yet painfully malleable at the very same time? Going beyond our original conversation, during our next episode, I'd also like to talk to a political scientist and/or sociologist about how this broader notion of maintaining one's political identity takes us away from the day-to-day pothole-filling task of being average, everyday citizens. Why are we launching this project more broadly? I think it's to make sure that every political narrative being put forth in our society is honest and being made in good faith. We don't want to live in a country where people just get to say whatever until whatever gets repeated so often that it eventually becomes our playbook and our agenda. But to continue this conversation, we're asking our community to help us in one of 4 ways, and each way is incredibly helpful. First, follow our podcast on Spotify, Apple, or your preferred podcast provider. Second, tell 5 people about our new pod if you like what we're doing. Third, to help us book guests and improve our sound editing, consider donating to our Patreon. And then finally, email us at the email address in this episode's description with feedback or potential questions or topics we should include in the immediate future. Thanks for listening to our first episode.